Okay, our next speaker comes by his obsession in a somewhat oblique way. He's Thomas de Wesselow, a serious art historian, great credentials, widely known, Cambridge, England, who has thrown up his conventional career and apparently abandoned everything in trying to solve the mystery of the Shroud of Turin. As I read up about Thomas, I came across a reference that says he admits to being a somewhat lax member of the Church of England, but now he finds himself arguing with the Pope in that he believes that the shroud is real, exactly as described, whereas the Pope and the Church have apparently accepted a recent carbon test which proves that the shroud is a forgery. But if Thomas is right, he, the layman, will rewrite 2,000 years of church history and give us a new appreciation of both the shroud and the resurrection. This is Thomas Wesselow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moses. Hi, everyone. Well, the reason I'm here today is that I've just written a book about the origin of Christianity. Now, I'm an art historian, as Moses said. It's a bit of an odd topic for me to choose, a bit of an odd career move, as he says. But it does kind of make sense, and I want to try and explain why. For the next 17 minutes, I'm going to try and convince you that understanding the origin of Christianity is all about understanding imagery. And I've entitled the talk, The Animistic Origin of Christianity, and it's all about that word, animistic. Now, the first thing to say is that the origin of Christianity is an open question. How Christianity began is an open question. It's clear that it has something to do with the supposed resurrection of Jesus, because it was at Easter, just after his death, that the disciples experienced something that caused them to believe in his resurrection. But scholars have never decided exactly what it was that caused the disciples to believe in the resurrection. Now, if you're a Christian, you tend to stick to the theory that Jesus actually was resurrected in some form. But if you're not prepared to accept that idea of a super miracle, the question is still open. It's still a puzzle. It's one of the greatest puzzles in human history. Now, despite this, historians tend to avoid the topic. They tend to avoid the question altogether. It's left aside as a subject for theologians and for New Testament scholars, not regular historians. Now, I think it's time this changed. I think it's time that historians, and art historians indeed, started thinking about the origin of Christianity. And after all, Christianity is arguably the world's most influential religion. What people believe about Easter matters. It affects what they believe about Jesus and about the whole religion that was founded in his name. So this is history that actually matters today. Here's something else that I think historians should start thinking about a bit more. The Shroud of Turin. It's a long linen cloth, about 14 foot long, and it bears in the center this very, very strange, very faint double image, front and back, of a crucified man. Ignore these burn marks up at the top, the parallel lines, top and bottom. They're later burn marks, they're not important. What matters is this mysterious double image in the center of the cloth. Now, this is thought by many people to be the actual burial cloth of Jesus. But let's be honest. It's generally regarded as a very kooky subject, the shroud. Some of you in the audience may have already decided that I'm a complete kook just for raising the topic and saying that we need to think about it seriously. I'd have probably called myself a kook 8 years ago before I started working on it. And the reason for this is very simple. A carbon dating test was performed on cloth taken from the shroud in 1988. And the results of that test indicated that the cloth dates from around about the 14th century. Now, for most people, that's enough just to write it off as a fake, a certified fake. As one of the carbon dating scientists said, someone just got a piece of cloth, they faked it up, and they flogged it, and anyone who thinks otherwise is just a flat earther. Now, I'm not a flat earther, believe it or not, and I'm not even a Christian. I'd actually say I was an agnostic if I was pressed. But I think that the glib dismissal of the Shroud as a medieval fake is just not clever. It's an evasion, not an explanation. It seems like a modern, rational attitude to have, but it's not. And I think that the tendency to dismiss the Shroud as an uninteresting object has had a major consequence. I actually think it's the reason why the birth of Christianity remains a puzzle, because I think that the Shroud is the key to understanding the early Christian belief in the resurrection. As an art historian, I study imagery from the 13th and 14th century, like the picture you see on the right. Now, if the Shroud is a medieval image dating from around this period, art historians like me ought to be able to look at it and study it and tell you who painted it, how they painted it, where it was painted, and so on. But we can't. And the reason is that it's not like any medieval image. Here's one obvious problem. The image you see on the left is the image on the Shroud. This is the cloth image, just showing the facial area. Now, it's a very sort of mysterious mask, but it contains an extraordinary secret. Because when you photograph it, and this was done for the first time at the end of the 19th century, you discover that tonally reversed, that odd mask, which is all people would have seen in the Middle Ages, it contains this extraordinary, astonishingly realistic, positive image. It's amazingly realistic, like a photo. Now, this would have been completely beyond anyone painting in the 14th century. I show you on the right, this wonderful painting by Simone Martini. It's an artist I've studied. And it shows you how people were painting the face of Christ in the 14th century. Now, it's very obviously stylized. You can see the brush strokes, you can see the outlines. Unlike the Shroud image, which is basically just like a modern photo. Now, here's a second reason why that image on the Shroud can't be a medieval image. No one in the Middle Ages knew about negative images. No one knew about negative images until the discovery of photography in the 19th century. And no one in the Middle Ages would have wasted their time, even if they could have done, producing an image like you see on the left that you could only appreciate if you photographed it, and then you could see the true quality of the image, the amazing figure in the middle. So, in my view, it just doesn't make sense as a medieval image. There's another reason as well, and that's that the image is vanishingly faint. It's so faint that if you get closer than about 6 feet away, it melts into the cloth. You can't actually see it. So no one could have produced an image that they couldn't even see when they were making it. From an art historian's point of view, there's another reason to doubt that this could be a medieval work of art. If you wanted to fake a holy shroud in the Middle Ages, you didn't need to create a forgery so brilliant that scholars like me and scientists working in the 21st century would be fooled by it. All you needed to do was to paint one. And what I've got on the right of the screen there is the Holy Shroud of Besançon. It's actually an accurate copy of it because it was destroyed in the French Revolution. Now, this was very obviously just a medieval painting. You can see how stylized it is. But until it was destroyed, this shroud was thought to be an authentic relic of Christ's burial. This image was thought to be a miraculous imprint. So you didn't need to forge the perfect forgery in the Middle Ages. People were gullible in those days, especially when it came to religious relics. In short, the idea that the shroud is a medieval work of art is simply untenable. It doesn't look like a medieval work of art, it's not made like one, and it's certainly not conceived like one. And that's why art historians like me, or not like me actually, have completely ignored the Shroud of Turin over the course of the last century. It just doesn't fit into the history of art. Now, here's the idea. Suppose, just for a minute, that the shroud really is what it appears to be, the burial cloth of Jesus. Actually, I just want to go back, sorry, I didn't talk about this slide on the left here, because this is the other issue, is what is the shroud if it's not a work of art? Well, in my view, it's simply what it looks like. It's actually a cloth with an odd stain produced by a human body, but it's a completely natural stain. There's no need to invoke a miracle. What you see on the left is a human outline that was imprinted on a mattress cover in the UK, in a UK hospice. And there's nothing else like it known. As far as we know, this is completely unique. At least nothing else like it has been observed. But there's no need to invoke a miracle. This man who died in this bed was not resurrected. Human bodies can sometimes create odd stains without any help from God. So let's go on to the idea. If this is, in fact, what it appears to be, the burial cloth of Jesus, what would the followers of Jesus have made of it when they came across it in the tomb? What would it have meant to them? Well, to answer that question, you have to shed your modern 21st century rational worldview, and you have to try and enter into the minds of people 2,000 years ago. You have to try and see the world through their eyes. You have to try and enter into the way they looked at images, which was very different from our own. Today we think of images as just mere shapes and colors, inert forms. But for them, images were potentially alive. They were not just mere objects. They had power. They were potential agents. And images of persons in particular were seen as often as live, conscious beings. They were able to perceive and to influence the world around them. Now, this way of viewing images is known as animism. And animism has nothing to do with stupidity or with the lack of education. It's completely natural human instinct. It's a part of human cognition. We are all animists. Even you and I, when we talk to our old teddy bear or something, or if you go to the cinema and you have a lump in your throat when you watch E.T. and think about the plight of this poor latex creature, you are being an animist. Now, animism was everywhere in the ancient world. You can't begin to think about how images were used and seen in antiquity without thinking about animism. Just think of all the pagan idols that were everywhere. Think of these images that are in people's homes and in temples and in shrines. These are all images that are seen animistically. They're seen as living gods. Now, animism was also rife in medieval Christendom. And it's illustrated particularly well in stories that tell of images that come alive, images that speak and move. And a very good example is this figure on the left. This is the crucifix of San Damiano. Now, it was through this crucifix that Christ apparently spoke to St. Francis one day in 1206. And it was very definitely the crucifix that spoke. It's described by the first biographer of the saint as follows. This is how he describes it. He says, Even though its lips were only painted, the image of Christ crucified spoke to this man and called him by name. Francis, it said, "Go and repair my house, which is in ruins." So it's the crucifix that speaks, but it speaks as Christ. Its lips are his lips. Now, people at the time were well aware that it was just a piece of painted wood, but that didn't stop them thinking that Christ's Spirit had entered into this image. Just as your bodies contain your spirit, this is another material object that contains a spirit, in this instance, Christ's Spirit. Now, this image of Jesus temporarily contains Jesus. In Roman Egypt, this animistic way of thinking had another manifestation. What you see on the right is a burial cloth wrapped around the mummy of a young boy. And in ancient Egypt, they had a sort of resurrection belief. They believed that a person's spirit could continue living after death as long as it had a body in which to live. And that's why they developed the whole process of mummification. But in case something happened to the mummy, they also provided the bodies with artificial bodies, substitute bodies, in which the spirit could continue to live just as well. Now, originally, the substitute bodies were separate statues and then sculpted coffins. But by the 1st century, they were often just portraits painted on the shroud, like this one here. So what you're looking at is the portrait, the painted portrait, that provides the physical form necessary for this person, this young boy, to carry on living after death. According to ancient Egyptian belief, you're looking at a resurrected person. This is a new substitute body, and it's just an image on his shroud. Now finally, just return to the shroud itself. Just suppose that the followers of Jesus found this image in his tomb. What would it have meant to them? Well, ancient Jews were just as prone to animistic thinking as anyone else. Believing in just one God doesn't magically make you immune to animism, as we saw with medieval Christians. If they'd found this extraordinary image staring at them in the tomb, or indeed later when it was shown around, they would have perceived it as a living being. And it was particularly important that this is not a man-made image. This is a natural image. And in those days, people didn't have a scientific understanding of natural images. They didn't understand shadows and reflections in optical terms because there was no science of optics. They thought of them as like living doubles of the physical person. They were like external selves. And the shroud image would have been seen similarly. This was a natural image which was found in the tomb of Jesus and would have been seen as a living double. In other words, it would have been perceived as a form of Jesus resurrected from the dead. It would have been seen as Jesus resurrected. So that's my argument. And that's why I think that an understanding of art history and imagery can help you understand the riddle of Easter. If the shroud was found in the tomb of Jesus, it would have inspired the belief in his crucifixion. So I think that the shroud is the source of Christianity. Thank you.
This is Thomas's book. You can find it upstairs. I highly recommend it. Thomas, I'd love you to autograph it for me. The reason that your argument actually resonated so well with me is that I dabble on the side in the collection of television sets and artifacts. because that's been my profession. And I've often remarked how commonplace we today take not only the capture of images, but the transmission of images. And once in a paper that I was writing, I compared the stained glass windows that you find in churches to forms of animation, that if you actually animated those windows, they would really amount to the first kind of projected visual imagery to which people would have been exposed way back then. So your argument works for me. Thank you very much, Thomas.
Thank you.
If you would take that back and give me your Hancock.